No, 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 no. The final seat is being taken, the door is shutting, so it must be time. What a fantastic packed room. A very good evening to you all. Welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm your chair for this evening. My name is John Williams. I'm a co-founder and now Director of Strategic Planning at Fishburn Hedges. And this event marks the fourth and last of our Media and Government series that we've been holding in partnership with the Institute. And of course, we couldn't have picked a hotter topic. The future of media regulation and possibly even the future of media. It's very much all in the melting pot, as you know. And it's an issue that really seems to face impossibly reconcilable forces and aspirations. Has the price of a free press simply got too high? Can government actually step in to regulate media, one of whose roles is, I would argue, to regulate the government? Have we in the past perhaps not taken self-regulation of the press seriously enough, as perhaps you might accuse Richmond Desmond of doing? Or do we now take it far too seriously, as we're told Kit Malthouse, Boris's deputy mayor, has argued in the past? Or has, ironically, the media finally become the victims of a media witch hunt? But ultimately, and I won't quote the Boris Latin, but ultimately, who guards the guardians? Well, thank goodness I'm just here to share tonight. I'm as an interested observer as you are, and we have a fantastic and very distinguished panel to take us through some of the answers to the question. And obviously, because we seem to have a very distinguished audience as well, I hope you'll all join in with your questions and comments later. But first of all, I want to just introduce the panel. Sadly, and he may well appear at any moment, Lord Hunt, David Hunt, the chair of the PCC, is detained at the House of Lords. There's an oddly timed part of the legal aid bill going through. He's got a couple of amendments waiting to be called, and he's no idea, as with the parliamentary process, when he might be called on that. So we may see him, we may not. But instead, happily, we have got Jonathan Collett on my far right, who is the Director of Communications at the PCC, a chartered PR practitioner, a fellow of the RSA. And he joined the PCC 2 or 3 years ago from being Director of the Communications of the Advertising Association. An interesting contrast there, or connection, because I think the advertising industry has shown an interesting and successful track record of self-regulation. And Jonathan also has got a past record, if that's the right word, as press spokesman for Michael Howard when he was leader of the Conservative Party. I turn next to, on his left, to Geraldine Proudler, who's a lawyer, a partner of Olswang, and head of their reputation management arm, and described by Chambers as a star individual for defamation and reputation management, which either makes you very expensive, Geraldine, or a sort of legal Max Clifford, or perhaps both, I don't know. Another interesting aspect to Geraldine, very relevant tonight, is she's a trustee of the Scott Trust, as most of you know that, of course, controls The Guardian. Thirdly, on the panel on my immediate right, we have Alistair Brett. Alistair is a lawyer, and I have to read out this to get it absolutely right in terms of which bits of the Times empire he's been involved with. He was Times Newspapers, and it was TNL, legal manager until the end of 2010. But he does now like to be known as Managing Director of Early Resolution CIC, a not-for-profit community investment company, trying to help people resolve libel and privacy claims quickly, fairly, and cost-effectively through voluntary arbitration or mediation. So Geraldine and Alistair may have an interesting dialogue on that later. And finally, on the panel, a very distinguished journalist in Anne McElvoy, who many of you will know. She's not practiced as a lawyer, as far as I know, but has done a vast amount of writing, broadcasting, journalism, and publishing over the years, starting at The Times. There are connections here, covering The Spectator, The Independent, The Evening Standard, where she was the main political columnist and interviewer. She's currently public policy editor of The Economist, as well as writing for the Sunday Times magazine, alongside a whole raft of books she's published and radio and TV programmes she's been involved with. Before I hand over to the panel, just to give you a sense of the format tonight, so sort of probably usual and familiar things for you. Each panellist will speak for a few minutes from their perspective on this topic, and then I'll throw the event open to the floor for questions and comment. And we'll see us through to about 7:15. You'll have spotted the Twitter wall up there, which is doing lively things. My colleagues Natasha and Rachel down at the front are going to be monitoring Twitter throughout the evening and possibly feeding in some comment that's gone through, but also perhaps tweeting a little bit about what's going on here. If you can possibly keep most of your attention though on the panellists. It's very distracting when we can't see it and suddenly a titter goes around the room at an inappropriate moment, and particularly on this topic. Anyway, without further ado, I think probably the last thing to say is I don't think this is an off-the-record occasion, so feel free to speak, to tweet, and to respond and to talk about this. And to kick off the evening, I hand over to the PCC and Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and Lord Hunt does send his profuse apologies. Very sorry he's detained on urgent parliamentary business, and so I'm afraid you've got me instead. To give you an update on really where we are with the PCC and the Leveson Inquiry as well. So to take you back, obviously there was a huge scandal last year. Rightly, the Leveson Inquiry was set up to deal with what were extremely major failings in both the media and in terms of regulation of the media. Lord Hunt was appointed as chairman of the PCC, and his brief was to come in with a blank sheet of paper to look at absolutely everything from top to bottom of the structures, see what worked, what obviously didn't work, and to come up with a new, robust regulatory regime. So he spent the early period that he came in really listening and consulting widely, talking to people about their experiences, learning how the system worked, what had happened, and he obviously followed the evidence at the Leveson Inquiry very closely. The evidence there has been distressing to say the least. There's been wide incidences of outrageous, terrible behaviour by the press, which clearly needs addressing, and there are lessons that obviously need to be learned. On that basis, he came up with a new model for a robust regulator. What he said was he was an expert in regulation. He'd looked at the PCC's structures and systems, and quite frankly, it wasn't a regulator. What it was a conciliator and a mediator. It did that job very well. The people who actually use the service are overwhelmingly happy. There's 80% of them express their happiness, but it was not a regulator in any way, shape or form, and it could not deal with the standards issues, the issues like the McCanns, Chris Jeffreys, the Watsons, the Dowlers, these massive issues that we've seen at Leveson. So what he proposed is to add an extra tier to the structure, a stronger standards arm with the power to fine, the power to intervene, and stronger investigative powers to thoroughly beef up the system. Now, he first put these proposals to Lord Justice Leveson at the Leveson Inquiry, and Lord Justice Leveson welcomed them very much, but he said, get on with them quickly, and that the devil was in the detail, that he needed to know where the sticking points were, what worked, what didn't work. He was very interested in Lord Hunt's proposal that there be a contractual model in the future, so that newspapers would sign up and be bound by these contracts and by the civil law to observe the processes of the new system. So in February this year, the Press Complaints Commission agreed, in principle, for moves towards a new body. And that is the stage that we're now at, a transitional phase. We have a director of transition appointed, and we're undertaking massive steps towards setting up a new body that will then be able to be again presented to Lord Justice Leveson, because it's not to preempt Lord Justice Leveson, it's to fulfil what he asked for, which was to get this thing up and running and to see the detail in action. And so Lord Hunt will have to go back to Lord Justice Leveson and talk about what's been set up, whether it works, whether it's acceptable to what Lord Justice Leveson is likely to conclude. And of course, the final stage of the process will then be that Lord Justice Leveson himself will report. I think he said this week it will now be October rather than September. And government will then be tasked with implementing those recommendations if they involve government in enacting statute in any way. So that's where we roughly are at this stage, and I look forward to an encouraging debate on these issues tonight.
Jonathan, thanks very much indeed. Am I to take from that then that the ideal situation is that Lord Hunt and the PCC comes up with their model, which in a sense is endorsed by Leveson in September, October, and then that goes forward to the government? Or are you running on parallel tracks? Isn't there a danger that you diverge at some point?
No, I mean, clearly, ultimately, this is a matter for Lord Justice Leveson, and that's what the inquiry is tasked to do, and it's his responsibility, and ultimately then the government's to enact it. What the PCC is doing is coming up with an idea for a new structure, a new body, and Lord Hunt has developed these proposals after considerable and serious thought. But the process is to work with Lord Justice Leveson and to go back with him, and then it's for his judgment to assess and to approve those proposals.
Right. Thanks very much for that. Geraldine, you were nodding there, but I think I give the floor to you.
Yes, I was nodding in the sense that it is for Lord Justice Leveson to decide. It's not automatic that what the PCC comes up with is going to be endorsed. I think it's worth just thinking, stepping back for 1 minute to look at the context of where we are now and how we got there. I don't mean phone hacking, because there's periodically a big issue about reform of the press. There's always some latest scandal, and if you think back, 1990 we had the first Calcutt report that recommended setting up the Press Complaints Commission. We then had David Mellor, when it was established, saying the press are drinking in the last chance saloon. We all remember that. Here we are again. We had the second Calcutt report in 1993, which said that self-regulation was not working, and that it should now be statutory. Cut a long story short, that didn't happen. And so then it all went quiet for a while on the regulatory front. The PCC was up and running, carried on doing what it was doing, and meanwhile the focus shifted to legal developments as far as the press was concerned. So we had new defences introduced to libel actions. I'm doing this very, very, big picture, but we had the whole issue about success fees, that the newspapers said were going to bankrupt them, that people on the other side who won, the lawyers could double up their fees. The newspaper ended up paying 3 lots of fees effectively. It was outrageously expensive. We had privacy, became a massive topic. The judges were then working on how to refine and clarify all the issues in relation to privacy. And super injunctions, latest hot topic, which by the time there was all the real furore in the press about super injunctions, the judges had dealt with it. They'd worked out what was going wrong, they'd worked out how to put it right, and were in the process of doing so. So all of those things have quietened down a bit. Their solutions are being found, you may think to a greater lesser extent, but it's work in progress. And the law courts are not as busy as they have been with press cases. And while all of that was happening, the PCC was quietly getting on with, I would say, 2 good things. It clearly, and I think as Jonathan said, it's widely accepted, it was not regulating anybody. We all know that. But what it was doing very usefully was firstly in relation to harassment, where it was helping to stop some of the media scrums. Not completely, but there was a process that people could go to the PCC and ask for the journalists to be called off if they were all camping outside your house, which was a useful development. And they've also been looking after the man in the street. The regular people who aren't film stars or politicians or footballers and who have a problem with the press can go to the PCC, and the PCC has been helping to sort out those issues. So that's all been useful. But anyone with any money preferred to sue. The PCC was not regarded as being, if you were rich enough to have the option, the PCC wasn't regarded as being the preferred option. So we've had this twin track going on, and now the position that we're in is that quite a lot has changed, and there is a surprising amount of consensus emerging during the Leveson process. So, for instance, PCC is not a regulator, that's completely accepted. proper regulator is needed, completely accepted. There is not going to be, the press is not going to be regulated in the way that broadcasters are, for instance, which is really, really firm, quite fierce statutory regulation, including an obligation of due impartiality. Well, that's quite onerous to have to try and, represent both sides of the argument, represent everybody fairly, etc. The press is not going to be subject to anything like that. Nobody's suggesting that. And also there's general consensus of the need to avoid government control. In a democracy, you can't have the government controlling the press. You have to have a free press. That's all agreed. Nobody's suggesting anything different. Nobody is suggesting licensing of the press. That's also not regarded as being, that's government control of the press again. So there's a surprising amount of consensus. Even to the extent that Paul Dacre the editor of the Daily Mail, gave evidence to Lord Leveson in October that while he abhorred statutory controls, there's one area where Parliament can help the press. Some way must be found to compel all newspaper owners to fund and participate in self-regulation. Well, that's quite surprising. You wouldn't have put any money 5 years ago on the editor of the Daily Mail saying Parliament should be helping the press to organise the regulation of the press. And in fact, where we are now is not that. It's not what Paul Dacre was saying back in October. We've now, if you like, got Lord Leveson working on what his proposal is going to be, and we're all waiting to see what that is. You've got Lord Hunt's proposal working very much with the press to come up with a proposal which the press will wear. That's the whole point of it. There's not going to be a fight about it. It's done by consent, and he's talking to everybody to get them signed up in agreement in advance. And then there is a third proposal out there, which has been put together by a group of people who, interested parties really, under the aegis of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and the Media Standards Trust, who've come up with a separate proposal. And the key differences are that the big topic, I think the biggest topic, is that Lord Hunt's proposal would be contractual, so that all of the newspapers would have a contractual arrangement with the regulator, which would determine, the regulator's powers essentially would come from that contractual arrangement. I'll call it the Hugh Tomlinson proposal just because it was drafted by Hugh Tomlinson QC, who's very involved in privacy and media issues. The Hugh Tomlinson proposal is for a statutory regulator, that the setting up of the regulator, the process for the appointment of its governing council and its code committee, who would set out the rules, would be based in statute. And so that's fundamentally different, and that is a very big area of difference. And then there are other differences of detail which we can go to if anyone's interested. And the question is the biggest question is whether Lord Leveson is going to go down the statutory regulator route or the contractual route, and then the detail of everything that flows from that. What happens if there's broad agreement, I think, that the new regulator should have power to fine newspapers who go off-piste, and to investigate properly, to call for evidence and to carry out inquiries. What happens if you go through all of that process and the fine is not paid? The media owner, gets sick of the whole thing and says, I don't want to be part of this anymore. I'm not going to pay the fine. I don't want to be. I'm going to breach the contract. There's all of that sort of detailed issue. And part of the statutory proposal in the Hugh Tomlinson route would give a statutory framework of mediation mediation, adjudication, and arbitration, so that any complainant would have to first go through that process, go to the PCC, try and mediate to reach agreement, have an adjudication by the PCC, and it's only having gone through that, if still no agreement can be reached and the complainant's not happy, then it could go to the law courts. So they're two quite different, very similar in many ways, but fundamentally different proposals on the table, and it's not at all clear yet which way Lord Leveson might go, or whether he might come up with proposal number 3. So that's where we are at the moment.
Geraldine, thank you very much. Before I go to Anne, I think we're going to talk a lot more against the options of going down the statutory or the contractual route, but I want to go back to what you said about how if you had the money there was more switch because of the potential ineffectiveness of the PCC of using legal remedies, the super injunctions and so on. Do you think that will genuinely, under whatever future scenario, will that shift back, or have certain plaintiffs got comfortable with using the law and bypassing all the different tiers of mediation and appeal that an enhanced regulatory system would bring?
Well, I think the thinking behind the Hugh Tomlinson proposal is that there need to be carrots. There need to be carrots for the press to make it worth their while to get involved and to give them some benefits out of it. And there need to be carrots for the complainants that it'll be in their interest to go down this route rather than just rushing off to the law courts even as they can afford it.
Yeah.
So the carrots for the complainants are a much quicker process, a much cheaper process, a lot cheaper than instructing lawyers. And there are carrots for the press that they will have new defences available if they go through all this process. Yeah. There are a number of different carrots in there.
Okay.
So he's trying to give carrots to both sides.
Yeah.
To get them on board, as it were.
I think carrots gives us a new hashtag here. Anyway, thank you very much.
Carrots.
And there's an interesting, interesting sort of challenge both for you to speak on behalf of the media, but also on behalf of journalists, because I think there are two stakeholder groups there. But Anne McAvoy.
Well, McAvoy, actually. I can't possibly speak on behalf of the whole media, or indeed for all journalists, as anyone who's dealt with any journalist knows, is like herding cats. So I will speak for myself. I reflect some of the Economist's thinking, but I think if it's clear that I'm speaking for myself, then no one's confused. Well, if Geraldine has just described a system of carrots, which is brewing up, there are going to have to be some very juicy carrots, because there's certainly a lot of sticks to beat the press, hidden in some of this fine legal language. And I think also in the entire process, and so I'm going to enter a couple of caveats about that. My first point would be that clearly the PCC does need to be more respected, and it needs to be respected as a regulator. And that arises really from the fact that it is seen to have failed when it comes to the hacking scandal. We can't really get away from the fact that most things flow from that, and that, if you like, is the original sin. But it is, of course, a criminal offence, and after a bit of dithering around, it was made absolutely clear by the prosecutor that it was a criminal offence, even if it was the interception of voice messages and not getting across a line and across a conversation. So, in a sense, we've been very clear from the beginning that what we were dealing with here was criminal behaviour. And I put that down on the record to start with, because then I do wonder how we got from there to me and many others sitting at the Leveson Inquiry a few weeks ago when we were discussing Page 3 girls and the rights and wrongs thereof, whether the Sun could run features about elastic knickers and whether this was eroticising or not. I mean, go figure. And basically what has happened is that we went very quickly, I think, into a kind of mission creep with it. And in a way, the mission creep is laid out very clearly in the title of the Leveson Inquiry into the culture, ethics and practices of the press. I think it's too broad. I think it is leading to a sprawl. Geraldine was putting her finger on some of the acute choices that Lord Leveson was going to have to make when it comes to his recommendations. But I mean, if his report is really to cover all of these things, this is going to be a multi-thousand-page document. How many professions, I simply ask you, if you looked into the culture, ethics and practice of your own professions in totality, how would you all look? I think it's too broad, and I think other problems then arise from that. We could perhaps come back to them. One of them is, I suppose, regulation and getting a definition of what regulation is. There seems to be sort of a slightly sorrowful tone when people say, well, of course it wasn't acting as a regulator, it was, the PCC I should say, as a conciliator, it was a service. Actually, in most countries that have self-regulation, that's precisely what PCC equivalent does. It can do it well, it can do it badly. What happened in the PCC was it simply missed an opportunity. It could have seen it had enough evidence from the Guardian newspaper that hacking was there, and it should have called people, and lots of people said that they didn't have the official powers to do so. I can assure you that had someone from PCC at that point, Peter Buscombe, stood up and say, I'm a bit worried about this, I think we should get some people in and talk about it, I don't think they would have, Fleet Street would have been able to resist that clarion call for very long. So I would only point out that some of the failures do seem to sort of arise from the regulatory structures and not only from the wicked press. We will, I think, end up with something, I imagine, with a very basic statutory footing. I'm very nervous about statutory. I'm very nervous about anything that brings the government closer to the press. I think it contravenes a quite important principle, which is sometimes harder to see when you've been living with it than when you've seen countries living without it. And I don't just mean dictatorships. I find sort of Scandi regulation difficult, where you have on the face of it a press that is free to go off and investigate wrongdoing and is, for a small because of its language, press is perfectly effective. But when you dig into it, the links, whether it's through subsidy or through who appoints people to the PCC, are too close, I think, to the government and the state. And we have to be quite careful that that doesn't happen, however many arm's lengths we put between it. And I would very much like to see Lord Leveson address that point. I noticed that Lord Justice Judge, who appointed Lord Leveson, did make that point very strongly. He was obviously concerned about it. It was in his mind as the press must be able to be guaranteed to operate at distance from the state. I don't notice it so much in Lord Leveson's thinking, but he may pleasantly surprise me and those of my views on that. But you know, I do think Dacre, as cited here, Paul Dacre from Mail, is absolutely right. We do need something that binds people to participate. And for that reason, I think some of us will have to swallow hard and accept a basic statutory footing, but I'm very concerned that it is simply set up as pretty much as few paragraphs as you could possibly put in a bill, and that the government steps back. And it's got to promise not to keep coming back for more, ladies and gentlemen, because one thing that we do know about legislation is once it is there, it gets revisited. And I would say that maybe people might like to raise other points in that area. Just be very careful of saying you can have a one-off statutory arrangement. It's a bit like a one-night stand. It can come back to haunt you in other ways. I noticed that John mentioned the parallel structures of the Advertising Standards Authority as something he thought was a good idea. My jaw dropped. I think it doesn't work at all, and I'd be amazed if we go down that route. I think all the professional bodies who are self-regulating, there are some weaknesses in all forms of self-regulation, and we simply rely on the good that they do out doing it. I don't think advertising standards is in any way a model. I will just give you two very quick examples. One is budget airlines who simply contravene ASA guidelines again and again and get wrapped. And 2 days later, they take down one hoarding and they put up the next one, so telling you that there's 10 hours of sun in the Outer Hebrides or whatever the claim may be. It's simply, there are no reasons for them not to do so. It's simply a repetitious process in which they pretend to observe the guidelines and we pretend to believe them. Just as bad, and it was just an interesting story I worked on for a while, is skin creams and claims about skin products. I mean, you know, any of those pretty much contravenes ASA guidelines. It's just nobody can be bothered to go after them. Just remember that when you're in Boots next time. So just all I'm saying is be careful about other professional models. I think we're in the mood in Fleet Street and the whole debate around it that there's been a terrific failure. See, I don't think there has. What I think there's been is law breaking. And I think you go at it a different way if you keep focused on that and you just make sure that your regulation is tightened and inspires confidence. Beyond that, I actually wonder how much control, after all this has happened, you will have. And And I'll just conclude by saying, because you must get on to the next panel member, things are changing so fast in the media. And when I see people discussing how much market share they think that Murdoch or someone else should have, or what we should be regulated to do or not do, or which privacy rules we must abide by or not, I think, my mind just goes immediately to the fact that there's some other way for people to get this information. There is Twitter, there's sites based offshore, there's, of course, just basing your entire operation in America, and you'll be very nicely protected by the First Amendment, and none of this will apply to you. So I am quite concerned that we don't get ourselves into a mood where we have one overregulation that I think could be damaging to the kind of journalism we have, to a vibrant press, which for all its errors, and we know that there have been some terrible and grievous ones, is, I think, still an enviable press to have. And that really, what we should be doing is improving it, is not constraining it, and please can we regard the difference.
And thank you very much indeed. I'm not really allowed to join in the debate, so anything to do with whether the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority model, is relevant or not, I'll leave to Jonathan later, although I think it is cited on your website, Jonathan, as a sort of parallel self-regulatory model, but we'll come back to that. One thing I did want to highlight, though, Anne, was I think your point about Peter Buscombe when she was chair of the PCC, just the power of office, no matter whether you're a strong regulator or not, whether you're really a conciliator, whether you have statutory powers or not, if you have the power of the office and the power of the platform, you can use that very powerfully. And I think, whatever model goes forward, and I say this is in the business of reputation management, I think that's quite powerful. But thank you very much. One thing I did like your point about mission creep. I just wanted to ask very quickly whether or not, with his very, very focused and incisive mind, as I'm told, Lord Leveson will actually ignore the elastic knickers and focus down, or are you worried we're going to get mission drift in the final outcome?
Well, I wasn't worried until he recalled there's basically an interest group, a protest group that doesn't like page 3, and clearly he doesn't like other things about the way that paper portrays women in some of its reporting. This is a perfectly justifiable position to take, and I happen to take the slightly more libertarian view that there's a spread of opinion out there, and you pay your money and take your choice, and that's a good thing. But I very much agree with people banging a drum and making a noise about their position. I was surprised that they were recalled. And I must say, then I started to think, what are we doing with this judge sitting there? It may not be in the final findings, you may be right about that, but I did start to think, judges are used for all sorts of things these days where we just don't know quite what to do. But I also began to think, slightly, who made you God? And I did wonder, really, why we were sitting through that, and I thought that was a classic example of where the parameters had simply got so swimmy that they had gone into a completely different territory.
And I think to pick up on that last point, we have sort of made him God, and that's...
Well, David Cameron sort of made him God, did he really, with this remit? I was very amused, I must say, when Michael Gove decided that he thought Leveson had mission creep and was going too far, and I just wondered whether he had actually mentioned it to his friend, the Prime Minister.
We can speculate. Anyway, thank you, Anne. Alistair, over to you. Are you a carrot or stick man?
Well, I started 6 months ago. We all met in Oxford, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and the MST, Media Standards Trust, to discuss, I think it was 8 options we had then, of how to regulate the media. And we had everything from introducing a First Amendment in this country, like America, which everybody was utterly ridiculous, and nobody would have their reputations protected one iota, particularly if they're standing for a political party, as we can see what's happening now in the States. And then we went right through to an Ofcom for the press, and quite frankly, none of them worked. After a great deal of discussion, we all came up with the idea that you have to have a wholly independent press regulatory body. It cannot be governed by the government. It cannot be governed by the media either. Either which way is going to be lopsided and biased. So you have to have an independent press regulatory system. Secondly, if you're going to do that, you have got to get over the Desmond problem. We all know what the Desmond problem is. He just basically says, excuse the language, bugger you, and goes off and does what he wants. So you have got to have a system which brings in the press properly and systematically to something. Now, the only way, this is why Hugh's decision, I actually did a paper before Hugh on this, because we were discussing it coming back from Oxford and discussing he was going to get a prison sentence for the phone hacking. It was very fascinating, I tell you. But we both decided, because we're both lawyers and generally will know this, exactly how we would try and develop the sticks and carrots process. The simple fact is nobody here in this room could probably afford to bring a libel action against a national newspaper. You couldn't even begin to afford to bring a privacy action, let alone a libel one or anything else. So we have got to make justice simpler, quicker, and actually more economic, not just to the claimant, but also to newspapers. Because if you happen to be at Mirror Group newspapers when they lost the Naomi Campbell case, they went down for over £1 million, and what did Naomi Campbell get? £3.5 grand. I mean, it was just utterly ridiculous. So you have got to look at the whole process. Now, if you do that, I then actually went straight off from the Reuters Institute meeting in Oxford to the Alternative Libel Project, which was funded by the Nuffield organisation, and that's been set up by Penn and Index on Censorship. Now, Helen Anthony, who is the researcher there, had done some fascinating research on different systems to govern the media or to resolve disputes. And one of the most interesting, one of the systems she looked at was the construction industry. Because in 1994, Sir Michael Latham did a big report on how big developments and construction contracts could get wholly bogged down when people weren't paying bills. And he brought in a fast-track statutory adjudication system for resolving disputes in the construction industry. Now, this somehow sort of clicked with me because I now run early resolution. Now, early resolution is designed to get media disputes settled within 28 days, which is exactly what they do in the construction industry. And you have to do it in the media industry because people's reputations are on the line. So if you look at it, I mean, most media disputes involve key issues. One of them, and Geraldine and I both know this, is what the words mean. Have you accused somebody of being a murderer or a terrorist? Or have you said, well, there are reasonable grounds for believing they might be a murderer or a terrorist? Or are you just saying, hang on, the police should actually go and interview this guy for a nice chat and a cup of tea? And those meaning disputes, whether it's fair comment or a statement of fact, as Simon Singh found to his horror when he was sued after his piece in The Guardian, and he was sued by the BCA, the British Chiropractic Association. Now, so many of those key determinative issues can be resolved very quickly and easily. Now, how do you get something resolved quickly and easily, and people not having to spend or put down a deposit of £10,000 with a good firm of media lawyers before they can even get a letter off the stocks to the newspaper? So that is how I did my paper. I started by doing a press ombudsman's paper, but I suddenly realized the acronym for press ombudsman's office is POO, and there's no newspaper is going to pick up and run with POO. So I then decided to call it OPRA, which is the Office for Press Regulation and Adjudication, because I was interested in a construction-type adjudication system. OPRA might appeal to Paul Dacre and other sort of press barons. Anyway, what my paper and Hugh's clearly has in common is sticks and carrots. And I'm just going to give you some of the sticks and the carrots, and then I'll shut up and we can have a question and answer. But the key to the whole sticks and the carrots is that one of the things you can do is if you don't join the new Media Standards Authority, you will get hammered in full VAT. As you know, there's an exemption on VAT at the moment. Now, this is not without its problems, because there are EU regulations regarding VAT. But there are a whole series of other things which you could bring in, which would actually help the press. One of them would be, if you don't join the MSA, you won't have an automatic right to have a libel action which has been brought against you in the newspaper transferred out of the High Court, which is hellishly expensive, down into a fast-track adjudication system, which would be miles quicker, miles easier, and simpler. And so what you do is you have to say, right, we will give you the opportunity to have all your libel actions taken out of the High Court into a statutory adjudication system similar to the construction industry. And in order for that to be Article 6 compliant to those who are lawyers, it means that if you as one of the parties hate the ruling by the adjudicator, you can then take it up to the High Court, because that makes it Article 6 compliant. Now, we basically decided that that is one of the big things which would help newspapers immensely, because if newspapers are getting huge costs orders made against them, they need to benefit from some system like this. Secondly, they could also have a kite mark so that you know that if you want to sue a newspaper, it's got a kite mark on it. That newspaper would probably pay for the early adjudication of the key issue which needs resolving. Because if it's resolved and the newspaper's over-egged the pudding, it's got to make what's known as an offer of amends under the Defamation Act. And if it makes an offer of amend, guess what? It pays only half damages. It's wunderbar for newspapers. They love it. But they need to know what the words mean and so many other issues. Now, there's a whole series of other sticks and carrots whereby you could get people into the MSA, so they really have to be there, and then people who are not there may pay, in some cases, they may even pay aggravated damages because they're not part of the system. They don't. Geraldine mentioned one of the best things of the PCC, and I know this from when I was at the Times and sometimes, and that's the desist notices. And you would get desist notice, and the PCC should never be underestimated for sending out sensible, useful desist notices. And that and its mediating ability to bring newspapers and realize the newspaper's got to do some sort of apology is well worthwhile keeping. But what we need is a new PCC MSA with the power to say, right, you now must pay somebody X thousand in damages. And without that, forget it. Nothing's going to come of it. And I suppose really at the end of the day, this last point, this all depends on whether you have statutory intervention or whether you say, as Lord Hunt would like to say, we don't need any statutory intervention. I have to say, I think the press, and Anne, forgive me, I think the press are completely paranoid about the use of the word statutory. There are endless statutory frameworks, enabling legislation, and all sorts of things. And the fact that you might have to have a statute to implement a statutory adjudication system, which everybody would love. All the editors have said, we'd love a quick way of resolving libel and privacy cases. If you have a statutory adjudication system, it's got to be there under a statute. And I can't see there's anything wrong in setting up, as Geraldine said, a new press regulatory body which is not governed by the government, but it's simply independent. And it would have ex-journalists on it, former editors, and well-respected journalists, as well as various other people. And it would not be controlled by the government. It would be entirely, it would do its own PCC code as we currently have. And that code is not a bad thing to follow, quite frankly. So I mean, all this business about we cannot have any kind of PCC, so we can't have any kind of statutory intervention, I think is absolute rubbish. It's paranoia gone mad. And there's the press forgetting its own Article 10 rights. You know, the government didn't bring in anything after Calcutta, because most governments are terrified of being taken to the European Court of Human Rights because it's mucked about with some Article 10 right. Anyway, I better shut up.
So no,
Get me
that was
started.
terrific. Thank you very much indeed. I want to come back on holy independence. This is almost your moment for the visitors tonight. Thank you very much, the panellists. What I did want to ask, I think, do we have a roving mic? The roving mic has roved in. But first, I just wanted to ask Rachel and Natasha, any highlights on the Twitter feed so far? What are people in the room or outside picking up on? Any particular kind of issues?
We've got a particularly interesting question from Chris Etheridge, who asks, are there occasions in which phone hacking is in the national interest?
Right. Any others?
Matt T asks, can the PCC reform itself to satisfy Leveson and get the press to sign up? Oh, he has his doubts.
He has his doubts. Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. Yes, I think we should certainly pick up on the point of the national interest. Before we come to the room there, do you want to pick up on the national interest? We haven't really got the public interest. issue. There was a good Financial Times leader last month which reminded us that the law is a grey area. There is a balance between journalists being allowed legitimately to bend the law, bend the rules, whatever, if the public interest is strong enough. Starting with you, Anne, is that under threat from this process? I mean, either because of what actually comes through in terms of the regulation, or simply because the culture will go to almost the reverse of what it seems to be. It seems to be in the World and Sun, where no one's afraid to do their job. Everyone's afraid to do their job. I mean, is that a fear?
Two separate questions there. Just do the last one first while I remember it. Yes, there is a bit of that slightly cultural cringe at the moment, but I think on the whole, as long as you keep the sort of multiplicity and diversity of your press and keep that in mind as a good thing, as opposed to trying to shoot down papers you don't like, which is sometimes there is a bit of that in this whole, not in the script tonight, but there is a bit of that in the argument. Then I think journalists will find their way back to good and incisive journalism. You see, where I have a problem, and it comes back to our old friend, how much statutory you can. I did say I could tolerate a bit, though I just wasn't enjoying it as much as Alistair. Is that the problem that I do have with that is that you then end up these weird trade-offs, like Jack Straw suggested. Is we'll give you great public interest defence, and we'll fight for it as politicians. We'll fight for it, but in return, you have to tell us how you're going to do this and how much of that you're. And that, to me, begins to put you into a sort of trading relationship with government. And as a journalist, I think we should stay well clear of anything like that. I thought the very direct question, very high hurdle, I would have thought, on phone hacking, if you would have to prove immense public interest and that the information could not have been got in any other way. Alistair was something of an expert on this when it came to the Nightjack case, not for hacking, but in online. He might like to enlighten us later about public interest in that one. I think, to be honest, there's a very high hurdle there, and hacking generally was simply used to find out bits of tittle-tattle and who was going to China Whites with whom at what time to get the paparazzi there. And that is kind of where it belongs. Of the many things I've wanted to do to find things out about politicians, I have not found myself thinking, God, I wish I just hacked the phone. Blagging, I think, is more difficult. I think pretending to be someone else, which again, a lot of members of the public find absolutely horrifying. You sort of think, well, if you think a real wrong has occurred, how else do you get that information? I think there is a wider sort of elasticity around that, and after all, this is a bit like the making of sausages. When we consume the sausage, don't forget that you do sometimes have to kill the pig. Well, you do have to kill the pig. So I think that there has to be that degree of... Unless I don't want a vegetarian press. I think that's exactly the sort of...
Actually, vegetarian press is a
lovely
way to look at this. A vegan press, yes. Then what else could like to come back on the public interest issue? Is that at risk in all of this and not being well represented?
It's interesting that there are various areas in the law where there is already a public interest defence. And it's very, very rarely even relied upon, let alone succeeds, because most of the cases that come up are what I call bad facts cases. It's nowhere near a public interest case. The footballers who's having an affair with who, or all that stuff that we've had over the last year or so. It's nowhere near the public interest. What possible public interest is there? And even when it's been sort of half-heartedly argued, as it was, for instance, in relation to Fred Goodwin, the newspaper initially ran an argument that somebody who's in charge of a major bank being funded by the taxpayer, if they're having an affair, then it's in the public interest. Everybody should know about that. Well, on its own, is that really in the public interest? And if there'd been some other facts...
She wasn't on the board, though, wasn't she?
No, she wasn't.
What was she? But she had a role.
She was an employee. Unrelated. Anyway, so the judge said it didn't even get off the ground as being a legitimate public interest. I mean, if somebody in charge of the BBC had been having an affair with somebody in charge of ITV, you can see conflict of interest. There are all sorts of situations where it clearly could be relevant and it could be in the public interest. But there haven't been any cases that have tested it, because usually when it's in the public interest, the press gets the right answer. Not always, Alistair, I'll say it before you.
No, we had one of the best public interest cases when Lord Levy decided to try and join the Sunday Times. And the Sunday Times had been given a copy of his tax return. He was paying 5,000 quid in 2000. And he's a multimillionaire. And I remember going to see the editor and saying, look, I simply can't tell you whether, in fact, this is going to be in the public interest or not in the public interest. It's going to depend which side the judge, the bed the judge got out that morning. And we were lucky the judge decided it was in the public interest because Lord Levy was a major figure in the Labour Party, which was at that stage seriously against offshore tax avoidance. And so we were able to publish. And so there are cases. I mean, and the other thing I was just going to say on this issue, and that is Hugh Tomlinson's actually got quite a good section in his MSA on public interest and how the MSA will work with the newspaper and give it advice as to whether or not the article it's proposing to run is in the public interest. Because I do accept, Geraldine, the vast bulk of the cases are the tabloid cases of, you know, soccer players doing what they shouldn't be doing. But there are cases where there clearly will be a public interest. I mean, going back to the Nightjack, you see, there I stupidly said, well, Section 55 of the DPA, Data Protection Act, has a public interest defence, and it does.
Yeah.
What I didn't know was that the Computer Misuse Act doesn't have a public interest defence. And this is the difficulty. We have a whole series of statutes which are strict liability offences, no public interest whatever, and then you suddenly have the Data Protection Act, which everybody says, oh, well, you know, data protection is going to become the new privacy law when people understand it, because it's completely incomprehensible. So, I mean, you know, I'm afraid to say this is the difference. I mean, again, when they were bringing in the Official Secrets Act, Maggie Thatcher said, no way are we going to have a public interest defence. Now, I mean, a lot of people would say, you should have one. And all I do know is the DPP won't bring a prosecution if he thinks the jury's going to let somebody off, like, who was it? Who was
Sarah Tisdall.
Sarah Tisdall. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you know.
Remember that one. Okay. Finally, throwing it open to the floor. If you put your hands out. Usual rules. Please say who you are, where you're from. Given some of you wear so many hats, pick the hat most relevant to this evening. And the roving mic is there. So I'll take a gentleman there and the lady there. The first two together. I'll come back to you, sir.
I'm Brian Walker of UCL Constitution Unit and a former editor of BBC political programmes. I think we're hearing rather good arguments for trying to keep the lawyers out of everything at the moment. But I just wonder, what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? I mean, I didn't know Leveson was set up to make, you know, dealing with libel a bit easier. That's a terrific idea. And that's not really the point. If we take away the clear offences, which are hacking and bribery, what are we left with? Is it somewhere in the middle, like to do with privacy, or, you know, what is it exactly that is the nature of the problem? And what is the nature, if you could, the lawyers might explain this, it's a constitutional matter almost, what is the nature of a statutory body that is not set up by government, or a non-statutory body that is set up by the press? Where do you go and get redress if the codes are broken? Is it do you create new offences, or is it our old friend judicial review? And there, I've said it now, the lawyers are bang in the middle of it all again.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
Over there.
I agree.
Thank you. Janet Pereskiva, and the most relevant job is some years ago when I was Chief Executive of the Law Society, and the point I wanted to raise was that there are some professions actually that do look at culture, ethics and practice, as does the regulation of solicitors and barristers. But 12 years ago, the legal professions were in the last chance saloon in relation to regulation, and we had a big fight on our hands to hang on to any form of lawyers being involved in their own regulation, be they solicitors or barristers. And with the government came up with a kind of halfway house of a very light touch oversight body over the Bar Council and the Law Society, which has an independent chair, lay representation and so on, and might be the body that, you know, something like that might just work for the press. I think, all of Alistair's ideas of the carrot and stick, almost all of them need a complicated bit of legislation attached to somebody else's bits and pieces of law. So maybe something simpler that just brought in a light touch oversight body, because I'm nervous if the PCC can't keep everybody around the table to handle complaints. how the hell is it going to get them all around the table to deal with regulation?
Right. Comments back on any of all that? Jonathan, I think I want to give you first go at any of all of that.
Universality is the first requisite of the new system. Everybody has to be part of it. That's clearly where everyone starts from, and that's why Lord Hunt came up with his proposals for contracts. Obviously, there may be other carrots in terms of defamation. That's what Lord Justice Leveson's put forward. But I think the danger with statute is, of course, that once it goes through Parliament, the temptation is there to tinker with it, and that's what everybody's worried about, that whatever good intentions start off, the temptations will be just too strong to interfere, and it's too big a danger there. So at the very least, we should give self-regulation this go. We should give it a go. Lord Hunt's got an unprecedented alliance. It's absolutely unanimous support from the newspaper and magazine industry for his proposals. Everyone's working very hard at designing the contracts, coming up with the structures in place. So give it a go. And I think that was Lord Justice Leveson's attitude when it was put to him.
You're not so sure, Alistair?
It's disaster. The press has managed to get away with, we must have self-regulation for years and years now. The one thing Leveson has said is he said, I really don't want to have another Leveson or another Calcutt in the next 5 years because I've ducked the whole issue of self-regulation. And he's got to come up with something which is really going to have muscle and a solid base to it. And really to go back and just say we can do this all through contract law is nonsense. I mean, how on earth can you... I mean, if we're going to be sued by Abramovich, let's assume I'm acting for a newspaper. A Russian oligarch decides he's going to take the pants off the Times or wherever it is. You've got to have a system which makes both the claimant and the defendant, puts them in the same boat. That can only be done by statute. It cannot be done by contract. And Hunt's got no answer to that. And so if you are going to... I know I keep on concentrating on, I'm afraid, the wretched legal process. But in fact, most of press regulation is about making the press behave themselves. And I can read you the list of statutes there are which make the press behave themselves. It's not just the Computer Misuse Act and the Data Protection Act. It's a myriad of other statutes which prevents journalists from doing things. Now, that is the law. What the press really come up against, which is really eating into the old hard copy press's bottom line, is huge awards of legal costs. It's not the damages which worry them so much. It's the fact that they'll end up paying £500,000 to one firm or another for an endlessly long process, which should have been done within 28 days. That's why we've got to have something like the construction industry new system. I want Leveson to be the new Sir Michael Latham. Introduce a new system which works. Yeah. And we can all be proud of it.
Geraldine, do you think, does that shoot down the contractual approach, or is that still a realistic option?
Well, it's the contractual approach. You understand why it's the preferred option of the press. So they're going to argue for it quite strongly, aren't they? It does have its difficulties. I think
Come on, Gerald, you can be tougher than that.
I think to answer your question about why is Leveson bothering with all of this stuff, I would say that the reason is that there's a perception that the problem has arisen from the culture that grew up inside newspapers. It was a culture that you could get away with it. There wasn't any regulator. You only had to worry about the law if somebody found out what you're doing and somebody sued you or prosecuted you, and therefore the behaviour got worse and worse because they could. Talk about the News of the World, obviously. And that's why he's looking at all these kind of...
But it wasn't like that at every paper, or even overwhelmingly. Oh, no. So therefore, why are you visiting the punishment on those who haven't committed the crime?
I think what we're really talking about here is actually a very small part of the picture. Because if you look at the media as a whole, you've got the broadcasters who are regulated to death. You've got what Calvin Mackenzie used to call the unpopulars, that are trying to do public interest journalism, and you've got the populars who are basically doing celebrity gossip. And it's the celebrity gossip end of the market which has caused all this trouble.
Yep.
But if in fixing that problem, everybody unfortunately is going to be bound by it. It's going to have it's going to make very little difference to what you do, when you're doing your job, and
But
a
from-
large number of other journalists.
I was going to ask you, you were going to come in anyway, but just that classic thing when you try to solve a problem with a much bigger canvas is the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think really there is going to be, a serious litany of
Well, I suppose because they're
obstacles?
unintended, I can't foresee them. It's just I can
Known
iterate.
unknowns.
Known unknowns, yeah. Some nervousness about that, and I just think that is just something to bear in mind, that you've taken a pretty big sledgehammer to crack a nut. I mean, the lady's point's very well taken about the Bar Council. I think that's a better example than the ASA. But for a start, the inquiry did not have this sort of breadth and publicity and emotion that this one has had. I think it would be fair to say that people weren't sort of screaming on Twitter quite then anyway, but about Bar Council reform. So this has got, and behind it has other interests. I mean, we heard Harriet Harman talking this week about how she wanted to constrain press ownership, 40% of what at the rate we're going, the idea then spreads very quickly in certain quarters that you can then get rid of or constrain voices that you don't like in the press. And that I just think is something it's a mood, and you could say, well, you can't legislate for a mood, but I think Lord Leveson particularly, and the PCC and how it behaves subsequently can influence that. And we do need to sort of get back into a more realistic position that actually we've got a lot to protect and to be proud of in the British press. No one's mentioned an Irish ombudsman, which I'm quite surprised by, because of all the unwelcome systems which I've looked at, I actually thought that worked reasonably well. I mean, he hasn't been tested yet, I think, in court. And I think ultimately, you have to allow that sometimes people are going to go back to judicial review. I think it would be great to have a libel reform of the sort that I think we all agree would be a benefit, but you can't stop people going to law in the end. The only thing I think that's just worth mentioning there is that Richard Desmond is in the Irish system and signed up to it. He has 50% joint venture with the Star in Ireland, and very quietly, because he loves all this, he loves us all sitting talking about how he's the bad boy. That's how he got the attention.
Right.
But quietly he signed up to it because basically his commercial interests were on the line, which I think is something that Alistair referred to earlier. So I suspect with a lot of fuss and hue and cry he'll come in. It'd be more difficult for a small publication like Private Eye, because they will say, well, what have we done wrong? We shine a light in a lot of places. They're much more uncomfortable. But I think we will somehow find a way around this. I think the Desmond problem, it is one of those sort of perennials, but I suspect that there's quite a lot in it for him to come into a contractual arrangement.
Okay, more questions. There's a gentleman over here. There are two gentlemen over there, and then one there. So if we can do those three together, please, and then we'll go to the back. So you first. Anyone who's got a mic, speak.
Mark MacDonald, and I feel quite outnumbered here because I'm a director of a private equity fund in London. We do invest in media, however.
You meant to be at number 3, or?
My question is that I seem to be agreeing both with Anne and Alistair at the same time, although they aren't. So I think that my sense is that I agree that a statute, sort of self-regulation with teeth, is the way forward. So to answer Anne's point in particular, could the statutory regulation be structured in a way that prevents mission creep?
Right, thank you. You say, yes?
Yeah, my name's Will Moy. I'm the director of Full Fact, the independent fact-checking organisation. We've given evidence to Leveson, spoke at the seminars. It's noticeable among the lawyers on the panel that the focus has been on libel and privacy. But Lord Justice Leveson's primary recommendations are going to be on how we replace the PCC. And what the PCC does most of the time is deal with accuracy complaints, sometimes joint with privacy, but the overwhelming work is accuracy. And that is a purely regulatory issue. It's not actually a legal problem, it's a problem of how effective a regulator is. And the public is convinced, and our evidence has shown, that accuracy is something that sections of the press are very bad at in places. And that is something the new regulator needs to get a grip on in a way that it just hasn't in the past.
And can I just say, and you're saying that the current PCC approach has just not gripped this?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
To be fair, let me give credit where credit is due. Full Fact is a very regular user of the PCC, And through our work, fact-checking claims from politicians and press, we have had corrections from just about every national paper, and almost all of them have had to be mediated through the PCC rather than with the papers directly. So I will say that the PCC, if you have the time and persistence to go through the complaints process, does as good a job as it can with the powers it has at working through with the newspapers, eventually getting a correction. But you have to be persistent, and their powers just aren't adequate at the moment to do an actually good job of dealing with accuracy.
Cheer for the PCC, isn't it? Sarah, over there. Thank you.
I'm David Seymour. I was readers editor of the Daily Mirror for 5 years. In fact, one of the things I would say to the previous contributor is that if all newspapers had proper and effective readers editors, I think that would solve a lot of that problem. Alistair reminded me of what he said, rather like listening to Paul Dacre, which is you agree with the first 85%, and then you suddenly wonder where they've gone. And I would like to ask, when Alistair finished off by saying that the desire was to make journalists and make newspapers behave well, I don't know how on earth you can possibly legislate for that, because what he might think is behaving well, I might not, and so on and so forth. And I'd like to ask whether the problem isn't so much, I mean, there's a great, I love Leveson. I'm not saying I don't love, I sit and watch Leveson for hours and hours and hours. I'm really enjoying it, so I'm not going to be hypocritical about that. But what Anne says about the danger to the press and the danger to the freedom of the press and freedom of expression is a really serious one. And what I'd like to know is whether the panellists don't think that the problem is actually, as Anne said at the beginning of what she said, I mean, she talked about criminal behaviour. I mean, there's a criminal conspiracy been revealed. I mean, it goes really deep. If you look at some of the evidence that came through last week at Leveson, it's nothing to do with the press and the way normal journalists behave. And similarly with the PCC, and perhaps Jonathan could answer this, it's all very well changing the PCC. It's the failure of the PCC to use the powers that it's got, to use the ability that it's got, not just over phone hacking, but on a few other big cases. And it just makes me wonder whether the panel think that the powers are there and the ability is there, if only we had the people who are prepared to stand up and use them.
Yes, thank you. Cons, again, Jonathan,
yeah,
go first.
It's a moot point whether those powers are there. It's something we've looked into a lot during the course of the evidence to Leveson, and that's part of the problem. I mean, quite frankly, the structure of the PCC hasn't been right. It clearly hasn't, and that's why there is argument whether those powers exist to investigate and indeed to pronounce, which is often what people want the PCC to do. So clearly, what needs to emerge are very clear and effective structures, which will mean in the future it's quite clear what can be done and what can't be done. I mean, what I would say is that the job the PCC does with the remit it's given, I think, and on the funding it's given as well, which is only £2 million a year, has been pretty good actually. And I think someone like Will would actually acknowledge that the service he gets from the staff in terms of that remit and in terms of those structures has actually been very good. And that's why the polling of the public, and also in terms of the surveys we do of the customers who use the PCC, there's always very good and healthy responses in those respects. But what's clearly wrong is a structural problem, the structure of regulation. That's what needs to be addressed.
Geraldine?
Actually, there is another point that comes out of that. There is a significant funding issue, because the higher the quality of the regulator, the more it's going to cost. You know, if the regulator's going to have powers to investigate, check the facts, you know, go into the organisation, potentially call for documents, all of that sort of thing, that's a lot more expensive than what the PCC is doing at the moment.
Yes. And going back to the point, Anne, about will any of this actually address the issue of accuracy in the media? Will's point.
Well, you see, I think that's a bit of mission creep for me. I think you know, the work you do is extremely valuable, and I think you know, as you've sort of indicated, you've pushed and you've got good value out of the PCC for what you do. But there is an element of subjectivity attached to the accuracy question. There's also a question about, you know, should all media products be equally accurate? I mean, clearly, if you're The Economist, you know, I've just suffered a Wednesday with the fact checkers. And it's an absolutely, you know, properly grueling process, and it's intended to be so because The Economist sells very strongly on accuracy, whether it's a, you know, piece of written on the other side of the world on an arcane subject to just a straightforward what's going on in the government. You get the same grilling of where did you get this figure? Or, is this by proportion of the population or by hectare of land sort of question? But you see, I think that would be a ludicrous thing to ask most newspapers to do, and certainly a lot of newspapers in a market where that is really not what they're doing. They're expressive vehicles as well as descriptive ones. So I would be very wary of making this, whatever this new PCC is, it's going to have enough problems without trying to work out exactly how accurate every single product should need to be to sacrifice that. Clearly, if there are glaring inaccuracies and you make a good case, then I think these days you will find a much bigger role. David Seymour's point about readers, editors, I think is well taken. We will have more of these characters around, won't we? I mean, that's just, you can see it creeping in already that we have page 2 clarifications and comment. I remember sort of, I won't say, jobs I was in before that just trying to get the editor to sign off a clarification or a comment. He knows what they didn't want, and they didn't want to put it in. And that was a really reprehensible thing about the Old Fleet Street, actually. And I think that's very good if that changes. I think we should be more open about our mistakes.
Thanks. Alistair, comments on any of
Yeah,
those?
I think one of the things which we're trying to develop on the Hugh Tomlinson MSA point is to where does the independent reader's editor stand within a newspaper? Because under the Hugh Tomlinson approach is that every newspaper would be audited under his system. And you would have probably a reader's editor who is there, has a degree of independence from the editor and everybody else, and actually deals with accuracy, precisely the kind of accuracy issues which currently go to the PCC. And they would deal with the PCC most of the time when it is an accuracy complaint. The legal department deal with the claims for the damages and other things. But if you are going to have an audit each year, and each newspaper tells the Media Standards Authority how many times it's had to, apologise and correct and all the rest of it, these kind of things. I mean, we are getting into quite a serious bit of bureaucracy and all the rest of it.
It's BBC compliance.
It's getting that way. And I mean, when you look at Ofcom's code, you think, God almighty, how on earth do they operate this thing? I have to say, I don't want all journalists to behave themselves. I want journalists to be irreverent and rude and difficult and all the rest of it. Giles Corran is not known for being the politest reviewer, and there's a load of them who I've worked with over years, and I love reading something which is irreverent and naughty and funny and all the rest of it. And the day that we have an over-regulated press, oh, God help us, then there will be no newspapers, nothing. Everybody will be walking around with Kindles and looking at things on a horrible little online screen. And I just happen to like newspapers because they make nice fires as well.
I always ought to end there, but I promised the people at the back a quick fire round of final questions. If you put your hands up, anyone's got a question. There are 3 there. There's the final 3, and then quick fire answers from the panel, and then it's almost time for a drink.
Thank you. I'll try and be quick. Ian Beasley, I've got 2 interests in this, none to do with the press. I chair a kind of regulation light committee which is linked to Ofcom. Nothing as sensitive as any of this. But I'm also a historian, and I've seen a lot of these investigations set up in political haste because they get a minister off the hook in the House and then repented at leisure because they take an enormous amount of time. I am not a fan of Leveson. I see Leveson on the television. I see it as a lawyer and a celebrity fest. And I think at the end of it, it will do what a lot of the inquiries do. It will reach for a structural solution, and I'm really doubtful about that. And I'd be interested in the panel's view as to whether there isn't a kind of moment now of public revulsion of what has been happening, that we can use the court of public opinion to kind of describe what is culturally acceptable to people who read the media, and that will be the incentive for the commercialisation side of things.
Bold request. Yes,
Roger Daw, Better Government Initiative. I can see the strong case for having something in between press self-regulation and government regulation, but the proposed statutory body, who appoints it? Who appoints a chairman? Who appoints a governing body? Because that would be very important.
Right, and finally?
Evan Harris, Libel Reform Campaign, and Hacked Off, which campaigns on behalf of victims of press egregious practices. I want to endorse what Will Moy said about accuracy, and I don't think it's right to say that factual accuracy is ever subjective when it really matters. And if people feel moved to complain about, for example, assertions by newspapers that MMR causes autism, which has very damaging impacts, for example, which was a multiple problem, then the fact that they sell lots of copies should not mean that they have lower standards, because they actually cause more damage. And the problem, one of the problems with the current arrangements are that whether it comes to factual accuracy or contempt of court, the newspapers don't have a system where they learn from their previous practices. So on Christopher Jeffries, they never learn from McCann. They never learn from Murat. They just did it time and time again because they get more money from selling the papers than they get from paying the fines. And on factual accuracy, they say the only thing that shames them is a resolution against them, not an admission, as an adjudication against them. So often they simply resolve the complaint, effectively admitting the breach, but it doesn't count as an adjudication by the PCC. And so there's no evidence that papers don't simply repeat the inaccuracies that are damaging, either damaging to individuals or damaging to the public interest, because they're just not doing what American papers, the land of free speech, do manage to do, which is adequate fact-checking as part of the culture, which is what Leveson was asked quite rightly, in my view, to deal with.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very big questions, but I asked for relatively snappy answers. But in terms of, is there a role for the court of public opinion? And actually, to amplify, I think two questions in my head is, can the system, or who is responsible for changing the culture in newspapers where that is necessary? And also going back to, can you, with any statutory structure, who appoints the new bodies or body? Can it ever be wholly independent if it's been created by statute? I'll go in this way so that the Borough PCC gets the final word, Jonathan. Alistair, you first.
Well, the first point about public opinion, public opinion, and the difficulty is we have newspapers which are wholly commercial and are only interested in selling hundreds of thousands of copies, if not millions of copies, each day. And their ethos is quite different from a broadsheet's ethos. And to suggest there's a similarity would just be completely living on another planet. So that is a real problem, because I don't think you're ever going to tame the tabloid newspapers, because they sell hundreds of thousands of copies, they make loads of money, and I doubt you're going to change an awful lot in their culture or the way they do things. Daily Mail's mid-market. It's a clear mid-market paper. You will get as much as it can right, but it will still... In culture terms, well, I haven't worked there, so I can't. Yeah. I wouldn't dream of...
Upmarket of Wagner, somewhere like that.
Yeah. One for every drinks.
New body, a statute is quite capable of saying that the Bar Council or the Law Society or any regulatory body should be made up of a series of people like previous editors of newspapers who have an understanding of the press and all the rest of it. It must have a couple of lawyers on it. There's nothing to stop it doing that. What you don't want is it carrying on meddling. And I understand to some extent the worries that Anne has, but I quite honestly, I don't see that this is impossible. I think that's what I say. I do believe you could set up a clean-cut body to do that. I think that's all I have.
Thank you. Anne.
Right. First question, I suppose it was about sort of whether it would stick or not. And I think just referring back to Alice's marvellous description of people reading things on horrible little screens, that is going to be the problem. We have structural decline in print, whichever way we look at it and dress up the figures. And, I am very doubtful about whatever we come up with, how long it will continue. I think it will not have a very long shelf life. I think we will be back here and we will be discussing it about the internet, online, and that sort of product within a very short space of time. I didn't get the feeling that Leveson quite grasped that. He kept saying, put Twitter on one side. You can't. Why, it's Twitter. So, yes, on that, public revulsion I don't think is a good test. I think people are marvellously hypocritical, including most of us, about this. They quite like reading things. It's the sausage thing. They don't necessarily want to know what goes into it. But actually, when people talk about public revulsion, I wonder how much of it there is. I guess a lot of people talking to me are very sort of they've got a lot of sang-froid about the press and the tabloid press, and they know that they're buying into something which has not always got with the best methods. I don't say that to excuse hacking or anything like it. It's just I wouldn't make that the test because I think it's just too variable, human nature being what it is. Yes, I think you can have if you want to be self-regulating, they have to choose who heads up this body. It can then be sort of mired in statute if we must to make sure that people actually pay the fines. That's as good as it gets. Well, I didn't say I liked it. I just said that's one way you can do it. I sort of have accepted that it might have to come to that, but I just don't want anyone involved in choosing people. You talked about ex-editors. I mean, we haven't talked about serving editors, and we won't now, but there'll be a big appetite to get them off. And yet, I wonder about all these lovely, ex-editors wandering around. And there's a bit of in-my-dayism that will then creep in. It's not the same as having representatives of the industry who are up against commercial pressure. I'd be really interested in Jonathan on that. So I should probably... Evan, it was a strongly worded point. Egregious practices, very bad things, egregious practices. I would say things like the cases that you cited, Evan. MMR, there were doubts in the beginning, and because I know you take a very strongly held different view, but to my mind, this was clearly a question of bad judgment by the papers, who continued to make links when the links had largely been disproven. So, that's why I think your accuracy point doesn't really stick, because quite often you have to choose between versions. Clearly you end up in a point where so much evidence is against you, you've made a mistake, and you should come back from it. And I think that was the mistake there. I also think with the McCanns, people always forget, the information was being given to them by the Portuguese press. They weren't just making it up. So again, it was a matter of judgment. It was when you stepped back from, you'd gone in one direction, as I say, reverse ferret, as they say in the newsroom. But because it was selling newspapers, they didn't reverse ferret. And to me, it was bad. I didn't even like being on a newspaper when it was happening. But I think it was a matter of judgment, not accuracy.
Thank you very much. Jeremy.
Course of public opinion, yes, and it lasts about 5 minutes. So I'm sure the views that people generally have at the moment will be different from the ones they have in a year's time when it's all faded into the background a bit. So I think there does need to be something more formal. Who appoints the regulator? Very important, and it needs to be independent. I don't think it works that a regulator is somebody in the industry that is being regulated. So appointments committee, completely independent, I would say. And fact-checking, is a really big cultural difference. The way the Americans do it, they have a completely separate person or team of people who fact-check, not the journalist who's trying to get it into the paper, which is just something completely different.
Yeah, interesting tradition. And finally, Jonathan.
Okay. Public opinion, it's clearly not going to be enough. It's structures and processes that's going to be the key to this. It's got to be a new body, and it's got to have teeth, and it's got to be strong, and it's got to command public confidence. In terms of independence, it's absolutely critical. The body not only has to be independent, but it has to be seen to be independent. So the appointment process is going to be critical, and they're going to need to command the support of public groups as well as industry groups. But I do think Anne makes a really important point about how important it is that peers are judging other peers at the moment, and that does add to the knowledge and expertise within the process. Having sat in commission meetings for 3 years, editors do contribute an awful lot to the process. A solution might be to take them out in terms of actually voting on decisions, but have them there as advisors, so that knowledge is there and is shared with the lay commissioners who will learn from it. But it would be something that would be lost if that's removed. And finally, to Evan's point, I think Evan on the whole is right. I've got one thing to pick him up on, which is in terms of resolved complaints, they are actually PCC rulings. So they are part of the PCC case law, and they are precedents, and they're firmly established within training, within education, in terms of the PCC website. But I think Evan is, on the whole, right in terms of lessons have clearly not been learned on major issues. It's obvious. Chris Patton's described Leveson as government by tutorial, and I think that's what it has been, really. We've learnt an awful lot from it. And so I think there's 2 crucial things for the future. One is that self-regulation really begins at newspapers themselves. That is the true meaning of self-regulation. So the structures within newspapers are going to have to improve massively. You're going to need readers, editors, you're going to need proper discipline, proper lessons learned, proper training, proper processes, and there's going to have to be a lot done on that. The other side of the coin, in terms of the top-down regulator, you're going to need a standards body, a body that can take tough decisions, can make investigations, can pronounce where necessary, and has the sufficient powers, such as fines, to actually make a difference. And really, what I would say to all of it, I think the Leveson process has been a good one because it's built pretty strong consensus, I think, at the moment about where we need to go. And I just hope that will build as we move into Module 4, which will be the critical module in terms of deciding how we'll regulate in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. Very quickly, I won't attempt to sum up. All I will say, I've learnt an awful lot tonight, and I'm really looking forward to how it does play out, both in the short and the long term. But just a few quick facts before we let you go. First to the Fishburn Hedges team, the tweeters, the organisers, everybody who's pulled it together at the Fishburn Hedges side. But particular thank you to the Institute for hosting this for a fantastic 4-event partnership. We've really enjoyed, as Fishburn Hedges, being part of that. Thank you to all of you for coming and for playing your part and for showing such interest. But particular thank you to an amazing panel, Alistair, Anne, Geraldine and Jonathan, for all their wisdom and insights tonight. Thank you so much. And finally, drinks outside, and as Anne said, let's just all meet in 5 years' time and have this all over again.
Thank you. Here we are. See, we've got